Hello, everyone. Welcome to California Transportation 101, a comprehensive overview of how transportation works in California. This work is sponsored by NRDC. So I'll start again by just thanking them for funding this work and ensuring that we all have a better understanding of this landscape. I'm Jeanie Ward-Waller. I am your host for this series and the Director of Transportation Advocacy with Fearless Advocacy. This is part 4, where we are going to cover state and regional planning. And with that, I'm going to dive in. So this is a quick overview of what I'm going to cover in this section. I'll talk about how projects are planned and built, kind of at a high level of how that process works. I'll highlight some of the key state transportation plans that guide what the state is investing in, as well as regional transportation plans. I'll talk specifically about a component of regional planning called sustainable community strategies. And then I will also highlight some of the limitations of how we do specifically regional planning and how that then is implemented. Again, as I did in part 3, I want to just lay the land with some definitions here at the top. Programming is a term I defined before, but just to remind you, programming is often used by regional agencies when they talk about how they prioritize and select projects for funding. So I remember that I think of this as kind of a promise of funding, a commitment to fund certain projects in the near future, in the next, typically it's 4 years, 2 to 4 years out. Fiscally constrained is also a term that we often use or hear in reference to planning documents. So a planning document, like a regional or a state plan that is fiscally constrained, is one that the agency goes through the process of anticipating the revenues that will come to that region or government agency in the future. And the projects that are included in that plan are only the projects that can feasibly be funded with the anticipated revenue. So it's a little bit of an approximation. It's more sometimes more art than science, but a fiscally constrained plan is one that is required to sort of live within the means and the revenues that are expected in that future time horizon. And then also there is a term called regionally significant projects. And so these are projects that are required essentially to go through air quality analysis based on EPA's definition. These are typically bigger projects, bigger capital projects, things like capacity increasing projects, either on the highways, this applies to rail projects as well. But these are projects that are going to have a significant impact on air quality and such. They have to be included in planning documents. And it's typipally not inclusive of smaller projects. So things like active transportation projects, trails, sidewalks, also, road repaving, things that aren't going to make major changes to the capacity of a roadway. Those are typically not going to meet the definition of regionally significant. All right, so jumping in, this flow chart here shows the general, obviously this is very high level, but the general process for how projects move through from the planning process, from kind of the conceptual level all the way to construction when they get built. So we start on the left there, top left. I highlight, as you can see, the yellow boxes are ones where there is, sort of built-in opportunities for public input. So I want to particularly, kind of pay attention to those from the advocate perspective. These are places where there is a required kind of public input or public comment process. So of course, the planning process itself, which is kind of the very initial, most upstream, where projects are conceived, where needs are identified. That's where major projects are identified in the planning process. From there, a project gets initiated, or project concept is sort of identified as, this is something we're going to move forward with as a project. In Caltrans terms, we call this a PID, or a project initiation document. This is the document that kind of defines the parameters of the project, the location, what some of the anticipated environmental impacts are, before you've gone through full studies, full design, full cost estimates. This is just, very high level project concept. From there, funding has to be identified for what are called the pre-construction phases. And the pre-construction phases are the ones in the middle of the slide. So those require funding, of course, especially if you're having to buy land, especially if you're having to do significant environmental studies, hire consultants, do detailed design. You need funding for that. So pre-construction funds have to be identified and programmed at that early stage once the PID document, or the project concept document, is completed. From there, the boxes in the middle of the screen, that part of the process, a lot of this can move concurrently. So the environmental document is an important piece, and there are several steps to the environmental document. There's sometimes several years of environmental studies work that is done that feed into the draft environmental impact report. And agencies, particularly for big projects, big capacity projects, unless a project is exempt from having to do a full environmental impact report, they do have to go through this process of developing a draft, releasing it to the public, noticing the public, giving a particular amount of time for public comments. It's a very well-defined process in law, and does allow the public an opportunity for input into the various alternatives for the project that are being considered and their environmental impacts. And then from there, once the draft is out for comment, the agency has to take those comments back and develop a final EIR. And then that final EIR gets approved and released before a project can go and complete design and go to construction. Concurrent often to when the EIR and the environmental work is underway, the agency will be doing things like acquiring right-of-way if particularly if it's a big expansion project or a new alignment of a rail line, there's a lot of land that has to be acquired. That's a significant process, often a very costly part of the process. They've got to go and get other permits and agreements with other potentially other state agencies, local agencies. So that work happens concurrently. And then there's also the process of preparing plans, specifications, and estimates, which is kind of the more detailed design. That sometimes does follow farther down the road of some of the other pieces, but that can also happen concurrently. Once all those kind of pre-construction components are completed, then the agency has a much clearer idea of the full scope and the need for funding to actually go and build the project. So often, this process, that next box of applying for construction funding can happen, before all of those pre-construction phases are done, but they need to have a pretty clear idea. You don't want to go get funding and then realize that there's a lot more scope that you didn't consider in the project, and then you've got to go find more funding. So that process of going and applying for funding, particularly if they're having to apply for competitive funding to the federal government or to the CTC, that's another opportunity for public input. So the agency that they're applying to, the project sponsor is applying to, they want to hear from the local community, the local stakeholders, the local governments about whether or not this is a project that's supported locally. So that's definitely another opportunity for input. Once the project has construction funding, it will go through, and complete final design, often advertise and award a contract to a contractor to actually build the project, and then go to construction. All right, on this slide, I just highlight some of the really key state transportation planning documents. All of these documents are developed by Caltrans. So Caltrans has this statewide long-range planning responsibility. And the guiding document, kind of the biggest overarching document, is the California Transportation Plan, which is the statewide multimodal plan. That is required by law to demonstrate how the state can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. So that's a really important piece of the modeling and the assumptions that go into the CTP. There's also an interregional transportation strategic plan. So the purpose of this plan is kind of to demonstrate how we are going to improve travel between the major regions, the major like MPO kind of metro regions of the state, and applies of course to the state highway as well as to our intercity rail corridors. We also have a state rail plan, which is very specifically focused on our statewide vision for expanding rail travel in the state. A freight mobility plan, which is the long-term plan for how we're improving freight movement in the state. There's also these next two documents, the State Highway System Management Plan, as well as the Transportation Asset Management Plan. Those are documents, those are two plans that actually have very similar purposes, and they align pretty closely. They're on different update cycles, but both of those documents essentially help Caltrans define how they will invest in maintenance and operation of the state highway system specifically. The Transportation Asset Management Plan is something that's required federally. So it's a newer document, and it was required under MAP 21, the federal bill that was adopted in 2012. And that document actually, kind of confusingly, applies to slightly more than just the state highway system. So there are some local roads that are owned by cities and counties that are part of what's called the national highway system, which of course includes the interstate highways, a lot of our state highways, but also includes some local roads. So that Transportation Asset Management Plan, or TAMP, applies to that whole, national highway system. So Caltrans is required to work with the local agencies to include the plan for maintaining those roadways as well. The State Highway System Management Plan is specifically just focused on the state highway system. So sorry that that's a little bit confusing. I don't want to go into too much detail on those two documents, but just know that those are the documents that guide the State Highway Operation and Protection Program, or SHOP, which is Caltrans' biggest pot of funding. We talked about that a little bit in the funding section. And then last but not least, there are these two plans that I referred to, or sets of plans really, that I refer to at the end of the slide, the Caltrans Active Transportation Plans, as well as the Caltrans Transit Plans. Those transit plans are still forthcoming. They're not completed, although District 4 in the Bay Area has just completed their transit plan. And these plans are done at the district level in Caltrans. So each of the 12 districts of Caltrans is responsible for an active transportation plan and a transit plan. And that really shows where the needs and what improvements are planned for biking, walking, and then also for transit on the state highway system. And little footnote at the bottom, some of these plans are updated on different cycles. Some are required every 2 years, some up to every 5 years. A couple of them, like the active transportation and transit plans, don't have a mandated cycle for updates, although Caltrans is planning to start an update to the active transportation plans. But yeah, there are a lot of different requirements that apply to these planning documents, both in federal and state law. And I think at this kind of Transportation 101 level, it's just important to know what these plans are and that they exist, and that they're all required to be consistent with the California Transportation Plan, the overriding document. All right. Next level of planning is the regional transportation plans. Regional transportation plans also both have state and federal laws that guide them and requirements that apply to them. But on the right-hand side here, I show all of the different agencies that are required to do regional transportation plans and their kind of current update cycle, when their last RTP was adopted, and when they're estimated to being adopting their next update to their plan. A lot of these are in 2026, actually. So important to kind of keep an eye on that, especially if those agencies are in your region of the state. And I just included here some of the sort of high-level requirements that apply to regional transportation plans. So they're required to be long-range plans looking, 20 years or more out into the future. They need to be a plan for the whole region. They must include a transportation project list, and those project lists are required to include those regionally significant projects that I defined at the top. They also have to include different scenarios for how that region is planning to grow in terms of land use, in terms of housing and employment. So they need to understand how population is changing in their region and how that affects the dynamics of land use changes. They need to be fiscally constrained. So we talked about how they have to kind of estimate the revenue that's going to be coming to their region in the time horizon of the plan, and then the project list has to be limited to only those projects that they can, approximate or estimate could be funded with that projected estimated revenue. And then they're required to be updated every 5 years. But for regions that are not meeting air quality conformity, or where they're in what's called non-attainment status based on the Clean Air Act, they actually have to update their plan every 4 years. So a lot of regions in California have pretty poor air quality and are those non-conforming regions. And so I believe more of them in California have to update their plans every 4 years because of that. And in terms of those project lists, there are a couple of terms that you'll hear. The term TIP applies to a lot of different, it's an acronym that means Transportation Improvement Program, but it's used in several different contexts that are very distinct. So I want to just define terms here. Generally, it is a project list, but it can be a project list that applies to different things. So the federal government requires that a regional transportation plan or RTP include a TIP, include a project list. And that is referred to as the Federal Transportation Improvement Program. And that's a 4-year program of projects. So specifically what will be funded, what is planned to be funded in that region in the next 4 years. That must be included in the RTP, and that's called the TIP. And again, this is not every single project, but it does have to include all of the regionally significant projects. So if a project gets added, gets funded that wasn't included in the last TIP, the region actually has to go through a process of getting approval from EPA and adding that project into their TIP, basically adopting it into their regional transportation plan, because they are now planning to fund it in the next 4 years. There's also something called an RTIP, or Regional Transportation Improvement Program. And this is a 5-year program of projects developed at the county level. And this is this is a programming document or a set of projects that is being proposed to the California Transportation Commission, specifically to be funded out of the STIP, which is a state level program called the State Transportation Improvement Program. So very, very confusing that TIP acronym gets used over and over. But the STIP is a discrete pot of funding, a discrete funding program at the state level that is programmed by the CTC. And so that RTIP that's developed by each county is a proposal for what they want to be funded with their share of STIP funding. So different project lists, same acronym, with slightly different letters. It's confusing, but I'm trying to just break it down as clearly as I can. And this slide just, I know the text is small, but I just kind of wanted to give a sense of what do we think of when we use the term transportation improvements. And you can see this, this was taken, I believe, from the SACOG's plan. Sacramento is referred to a bunch in here, but this is showing kind of the just how these projects can be referred to. Sometimes it is very specific. It's a very specific kind of defined improvement. And sometimes it's more, the descriptions are more vague, but typically it's, a description of a project, a planned investment. And yeah, you can just get a flavor for what that term means, transportation improvement. All right, now I want to talk about sustainable community strategies. So sustainable community strategies are a required component of a regional transportation plan just for MPO regions. This only applies to MPOs. So there was a very important state law adopted back in 2008, authored by Darrell Steinberg, called SB 375. We're talking about SB 375 a lot now in 2026 because there's an active discussion about reform to this law. But this is a really foundational law in terms of how we think about transportation planning, both for housing and land use as well as transportation. And this is the law that required sustainable community strategies. So essentially what SB 375 did was it said that land use and housing strategies have to be included in a region needs to essentially look at different scenarios of land use and housing as a component of their regional transportation plan. And when the transportation and housing is coordinated through this planning document, the MPO or the regional agency has to demonstrate that it is possible in their region to meet a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. And you can see some examples of targets here. The target in 2008, the kind of time horizon or future target that was set was 2035. So you can see in the four major metro regions, we call them the big four MPOs here. The target for 2035 was set at 19%. So pretty ambitious target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And really the goal, as it's stated in SB 375, is to create more walkable communities and reduce driving. So this is more focused on reducing VMT or vehicle miles traveled than it is on things like electric vehicle adoption and other ways that we might reduce greenhouse gas emissions. SB 375 also required regional housing needs assessment. So there has to be coordination between the regional housing needs assessment, which is a process that goes through the Department of Housing and Community Development. HCD, that department, sets targets for every jurisdiction in the state for what their housing needs to be, and that needs to be coordinated with this SCS, Sustainable Community Strategies process. CARB sets those greenhouse gas reduction targets for the SCS, and they are required to update those targets every 8 years. They have discretion to do the update sooner if they would like. And there is a provision for regions in the case that they cannot meet the target that gets set by CARB. They can't demonstrate in their plan that there is a future whereby they can meet that GHG reduction target. And in that case, they are required to do this thing called an alternative planning strategy. So instead of an SCS, they do an APS. And that does make them ineligible for certain state transportation programs that were established under SB1. So that's the one kind of, essentially enforcement mechanism that was built into SB 375. And I'll just note that so far we haven't seen any region develop an APS or an alternative planning strategy. So don't really have a great understanding of exactly what the APS would look like in practice. And this, I just wanted to show you a snapshot. Again, this is taken from SACOG's plans. This is looking at the Sacramento region, but just want to give you an example of what a land use forecast looks like. And the text, in the legend is quite small, but you can see kind of in the denser downtown part of Sacramento and the inner suburbs, you can see that there's really, those major, more transit-oriented areas are defined as center and corridor communities. There's the purple areas. These are areas that are actively developing and where there's housing being built and growth happening. And then there's the yellow are rural and, areas where there is some residential housing, but much more rural spread out. And the green are the areas that are, really planned to not be developed. So the MBO is, really trying to understand where development is going to happen, where development should happen, so that we can make sure that the transportation can serve that development in the future. And because of SB 375, because of those greenhouse gas reduction targets, the goal really is to try to have more development happen in infill areas, in existing communities, in areas that are already served by transit. So you can see the projected growth is really, higher in those center and corridor communities that are already pretty well served by transit and existing transportation facilities. Less growth in the rural areas and the developing communities. And then this slide just gives you a flavor of how, the transportation investments in the plan. This is showing the SCAG region, or the Southern California region, and the Bay Area MTC. And the spending, or the regional transportation plan investment projection that's planned over the life of the plan. And these charts were taken from a dashboard that CARB produces, called the SB 150 data dashboard, that really tracks these planning documents very closely and their progress over time. And I think what I want to highlight and just, help you understand here is there's still really significant investment in road expansion planned, even though, particularly in MTC, the blue part of the chart is large. The transit investment is really significant, particularly in operating transit over the time horizon of the plan. But there's still, that smaller looking slice of road expansion is still $15 billion over the life of the plans. And that is significant, particularly because what we see is a lot of that road expansion investment is happening in the earlier years of the plan. Those projects are higher priority in the near term, and the transit investment and some of the other more multimodal investments get pushed out into the outer years of the plan, which makes it just that much harder to reach the greenhouse gas target that the plans are aiming for. Same chart here. This is showing the Sacramento region as well as Fresno, and in contrast to what the last slide showed, which was the Bay Area and Southern California, the road investment piece of the pie in these two regions that are growing in more of a sprawl pattern is much higher in terms of road expansion. Although you'll note I included the dollar amounts on the road expansion piece of the pie. Those are smaller dollar amounts than in the MTC region, even though the MTC region, it was just a very small slice of the pie. So it gives you a sense of scale in terms of how much is being invested. But in these regions, the proportion of overall investment over the life of the plan is much higher in terms of road spending, particularly road expansion. And this, this chart again is taken from that SB 150 data dashboard, and this is showing really the results of the fact that we're continuing to invest in roads and in road expansion particularly. We're not making progress towards that target that was established for 2035, which is a 19% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. This chart is showing both statewide numbers for both VMT over time, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. You can see they correlate pretty closely, although they don't exactly follow, partly because we're electrifying more and more vehicles in the state. But essentially what you're seeing is a big dip in 2020 because of the pandemic, because people really weren't traveling for many months. But VMT and GHG have jumped right back up and are back to their baseline pre-pandemic level and continuing to grow because we are investing so much in road expansion. And I just want to note too, here on the left side of the slide, I highlight SB 150 because this was a really important bill, actually sponsored by Climate Plan back in 2017. And this was a bill that required tracking of SB 375, tracking of all the regions' SESs and their progress towards our climate targets. So it requires CARB to do this analysis and publish the progress for each region every 4 years. And I just want to round out this section by talking about some of the limitations of regional planning. Of course, SB 375 and the requirement to do sustainable community strategies and really demonstrate how regions might possibly be able to reach a climate target by reducing driving and investing in multimodal alternatives. That was a big step forward for the state back in 2008. Unfortunately, we're now, more than 15 years on from SB 375 going into effect. We've seen some really great planning work be done in all of our regions. However, we're really not seeing implementation to the degree we would like to. And so I just highlight some of the reasons why that is. The top one is that local cities and counties, local agencies are still really responsible for implementation, both, permitting housing as well as they control a lot of transportation funding. And they are making decisions and sponsoring transportation projects that are really sometimes working against the plans, or they're prioritizing the road investment in the plans over the other multimodal improvements. So that local control, that issue that it's really up to local agencies what gets built in terms of permitting housing and investing in a lot of transportation projects, is really undermining our ability to address these needs that really need to be thought about more at a regional level. And a big reason for that too is the local sales tax measures. I talked about that in the funding section, that there is this locally generated funding at the county level. That locally generated money, those sales tax measures often commit regions, for several decades for the life of that measure to projects that are expanding roadways. Once they're adopted at the local level, those agencies really feel very committed to having to build those projects, whether or not the needs of the region change over those several decades or, state law changes. The sales tax measures stay committed to those project lists, those expenditure plans. Another real limitation of how we do regional planning is the modeling and the technical work that goes into the plan. Agencies use really sophisticated models and they seem very scientific and accurate. However, modeling is really more art than science. It's really a best guess. It's making assumptions about, what we've seen in the past in terms of the cost of gas, for example, in terms of, how people might change their behavior to choose to walk or bike or choose to take transit, and using those assumptions from the past and sort of guessing at what the future might look like. So while models are very complicated, it's important to do transportation modeling so we have some kind of scale of what we think changes in the future may look like. But there's a lot of manipulation that can go into a model, and the assumptions that you make, again, in terms of things like the cost of driving, will really change the outcomes of the model and whether or not the region can show that they can meet that greenhouse gas target. Regional agencies also have a real variety of control over funding. And I talked about this a little bit when I explained all the different regional agencies around the state and how they have very different requirements that apply to them and different authorities that are uniquely defined in law. And a lot of our regional agencies don't have that much control over funding. The funding may be controlled at county level. It may be awarded at the state level. It doesn't necessarily flow directly through the regional agency in a way that that agency has an ability to make change. So even though the regional agencies are doing this planning, they don't necessarily have the ability to direct all the funding in their region. And the result of all of these limitations is we really are not seeing the implementation of the plans that we would like, and we're not making progress towards those targets. All right, that brings me to the end of part 4. Thank you so much. I hope you have a better understanding now of how we do planning for transportation in the state, and hope you will go back and watch the first 3 parts if you haven't already, and join us for the next part 5. And you can find today's slides in the video description.